Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm a designer. I've been working on various kinds of software as a designer and product manager for a few decades. And I'm originally from New York, and now I live in Hamburg. So this talk is going to be about the climate, and my focus is very much on the future and some impacts that the climate will have that I don't think have been discussed very much because they're not really easy to discuss. I think one reason they're not easy is because they're a little disturbing. So I'll just give you a warning that I'm going to talk about the people who will die from climate change. But it's also not easy because I think there's a lot of design and usability work that needs to be done to help us reduce those deaths as much as possible. And that's what I'll be talking about today. But let me start with a happy thought. Let's imagine it's the year 2060 and we have solved the climate emergency. Imagine that the whole world is running on clean, renewable energy, and we've made great strides towards sustainability in many ways. And this is, a realistic prediction. Many energy experts estimate that by 2050, we could stop use of all fossil fuels. So 2060 is a conservative estimate. And I think it's safe to assume that at some point in the future, the use, or at least most use of fossil fuels will become illegal. And so, as you'll see, I'm very interested in how they become illegal and what part that we can play in achieving that. But on the way to 2060, the World Health Organization estimates that over 5 million people could die between the years 2030 and 2050. And that's from things that you would expect, things like increased heat waves, forest fires, storms. But there's also second order effects. So when there are some parts of the world that get hotter, they have more mosquitoes. More mosquitoes leads to more malaria. And so when you start to model all those impacts, you see there's an enormous amount of change that we're not really prepared for. Some good news is that there's been a group of legal experts working for the past 5 years to try to think about how do we protect people in the future the same way that we protect people now? Like, how can we give future generations the same human rights that you or I enjoy? And they've just finished their work this past February. They came together in Maastricht in the Netherlands. And just this past summer, they published these principles. And the principles outline what they call how to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of future generations. So one example is the obligation to respect a requirement around how we produce waste and hazardous substances, that if we produce those, the generation that produced those must figure out how to manage those and safely dispose of them and not pass that problem on to a future generation. So you can go to the website and read through it all. And for a legal document, it's fairly readable. Any of us can understand it easily. But that said, you probably haven't heard of it. And I think that's because although it's so incredibly important, it has the potential to become international law and really change so much about our world, it's pretty boring to read. I think that starts with the title doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. It's usually abbreviated as the principles, and that's a bit vague and doesn't really have any impact for us. And if you compare that to how we publicize other kinds of climate information, for example, if I Google these principles, I receive less than 3,000 references to it. But any random climate TikTok has over 500,000 likes. So it really makes me think about what it means to be usable these days, and how we can get ideas like this out into the world. So if you go back and think about all the characteristics of usability that we traditionally design for and measure, it's the things on the left. And they're great, but I think we're in a new world now where we get so much of our information via social media and via other media that are so different than what we had in the 50 years ago when a lot of these criteria were invented, where things almost need to be exciting and shareable and believable in order to be usable. And so it makes me think about how to go beyond the usual characteristics of usability to get these important ideas out into the world. So one small thing I've thought about when I think about how to redesign those Maastricht principles is to think about how to frame them differently, basically creating new words that describe what the Maastricht principles are describing. And so I'm just going to show you that small example here, but essentially what I did was to start listing out lots of words that refer to the future, lots of words that refer to death, and to think about, what can we kind of, in a pithy way, kind of encapsulate those ideas so that they can be shared on social media and shared in broadcast media, traditional media, in a way that's easier for people to absorb than reading the principles. One word that came to mind was genocide, because if we are thinking about potentially 5 million people dying in the future from climate change, I don't think it's over dramatic to compare it to genocide. It's really, we're thinking about how to save that many people on that scale. And so I started to do some research into genocide, and what I found really surprised me, and it might surprise you too. So let me put that to you in the form of a quiz. So I'm curious, when do you think the term genocide was created? Over on Wikipedia, there's a list of over 40 genocides, and they genocides that are recognized by scholars, and they have them all the way going back to the 1200s. In France, the Taino genocide was in the Caribbean, and then you're probably more familiar with the events in the 20th century. I'm seeing some people throw out answers in the chat, which is great. I'd love to see any other guesses you might have. I'll pause for a minute so you can vote or think about it. And the answer is 1944. So if you guessed D, you were correct. So I think this is interesting that it wasn't invented until 1944. It took a couple more years to become popular, and then a couple more years before it was adopted into law. And even Winston Churchill in 1941 was talking about what was happening during the Holocaust and didn't have a name to describe what was happening, and explicitly pointed out that he didn't have a name to talk about what was happening. So I thought it was fascinating that we've had genocides for over 700 years, with a lot of people dying before we really even had a name to describe what was happening. And if you don't have a name, it's hard to communicate about what's happening, and it's especially hard to make a law and start prosecuting people for that. So before I get into the future, let me just talk about a little bit of what happens in the present and try to connect some of these ideas together. So let me show you a map. This is some of the work that I do with a nonprofit organization called Climate Central. And I'll just walk you through what this map is communicating. If you were here in Hamburg last summer, you know it was very hot. July 20th was the hottest day on record in Hamburg. And now, just in the past about 11 years, scientists have created something called attribution science, where they've taken all past weather records and modeled what the weather probably would have been like without humans and without the Industrial Revolution, and then what it is now with humans and with the industry we have. And then try to calculate the probability that the weather was caused by climate change. And so what this is essentially showing you is that, in Hamburg on July 20th, 2022, that weather was twice as likely to have been caused by climate change. And down on the east coast of Italy, it was 5 times more likely to be caused by climate change. But that's not the case everywhere all the time. You can see down in Turkey, that weather was not likely to have been caused by climate change. But this is basically just trying to make the science easier to access so that we can start to make that connection that we would kind of know climate change is making changes in the weather, but this is really trying to make that explicit and communicate that idea. And by the way, this is all available for free. You can go to climatecentral.org and play with this map if you like. But in the specific example of the heat last summer, 60,000 people died in Europe just from this heat. And we call these heat-related deaths, but now we know from the science that the heat was caused by climate change. So it seems like we really should be saying that these are climate change-related deaths. But we don't really have a name that that sums up what's happening here. A name that communicates this idea that people are dying from climate change. And so I think that's a word that we need. If you're feeling ambitious, that's some good homework for you to go out and create a word that I think we need to describe this concept. And just to really explicitly connect some of these ideas, we know that fossil fuels cause climate change. They're responsible for 90% of the greenhouse gases that cause climate change, and that's causing extreme weather. We think, at least that the World Health Organization thinks that's going to result in over 5 million deaths. And so we can really say now with a lot more confidence with the science that fossil fuels will kill, use of fossil fuels will kill over 5 million people. And this idea, I think, is also something that we don't really have a word for. The idea that people in the future will die because of decisions we're making now, and really what the Maastricht principles are trying to address. So eventually, if we're going to reach that kind of perfect, beautiful future I talked about at the beginning, I think fossil fuels will have to become illegal, and so we'll need words and laws to help us do that in the same way that the word genocide help us do that. And so just throwing out another idea into the conversation, a word called futuricide. And this essentially combines that idea of the future and of death on a large scale. And I define it as knowingly committing acts that cause deaths in the future. And when I Google this, there actually is a few mentions of this word already, but generally speaking, it's a new word. It hasn't really entered the lexicon. And this may or may not be something that enters the lexicon, but just an example of how I'm trying to take the things I'm seeing in science and in law and trying to encapsulate those and make them more popular. So if you compare it to the Maastricht principles on the human rights of future generations, If we expressed futuricide in the form of a hashtag, it's a little more pithy. It might it doesn't really capture all the ideas that are in the principles. It's a long document, and it's very thorough, but it might capture that kind of the frame that that sparks all those ideas in people's minds when they hear futuricide, of all the things that we're doing that will cause deaths in the future. So creating new words, I think, is just one way of many that we'll need to do things that we can contribute as designers. I think we'll need new images, videos, memes, and stories. This is just another example of the work done at Climate Central. They make a tool where you can look at different places and model what will happen with sea level rise if the global temperature warmed up. So this is one neighborhood in Hamburg that currently is doing just fine, but will be unlivable if the global temperature gets up to 3 degrees Celsius. And we're, of course, accustomed to flooding here in Hamburg, but at this point, it will get to the point where there's really a whole generation of people who will lose their homes, if the climate change continues to go in the direction that it is. So just to sum up all those ideas, I think there's a lot of great work being done in science and law that has already connected and kind of created a legal framework to essentially outlaw some of the harmful practices that are causing climate change, but they haven't really made their way into the popular consciousness. And to do that, I think it's going to require our skills, our design and usability skills, to make these ideas more usable, and more usable not in the traditional sense of legible or accessible, but going beyond that to make them shareable, exciting, etc. And I think there's incredible potential for all of us to apply our skills to do this. So thank you very much.